Okay, my name's Dr. Mike Nevell. I'm the Industrial Heritage Support Officer for England, based at the Iron Bridge Gorge Museum Trust, but I'm also an honorary lecturer in archaeology at the University of Salford. And I've spent the last 4 years looking at climate change and heritage, working on a European project, Horizon 2020 projects, that's funded by the European Union, whose aim was to come up with management systems to help owners and users of heritage sites in Europe cope with climate change. So the UK end of that project was based in Mella, and Mella has a variety of heritage from the Bronze Age through to the industrial period. And we're an upland Northern European site, whereas the other 4 pilot sites in this project were in Portugal on the coast, in Italy, in Greece, and in Turkey. So the aim of the project was really to compare a variety of different landscapes in Europe and their vulnerability to climate change, and looking at the variety of different management techniques available, and to come up with a proposal for how those sites might be managed, both for acute short-term climate events like storms, flooding, and long-term climate change, where you've got consequences such as drying and wet episodes leading to fires, when we've had moorland fires in Manchester this spring, incredibly enough. Whereas in February we had one of the wettest Februaries ever in terms of rain, and that led to a series of floods. And also long-term climate change leads to changes in the vegetation on heritage sites. You get new invasive species, you get landscapes drying out, which leads to erosion. So it's not just about coastal erosion or river erosion, it's about changes to the landscape which mean that the stability of heritage sites, whether they're ruinous textile mills from the 18th century or Bronze Age barrows from 4,000 years ago, mean they're under threat. And this is all about managing that change and giving owners and users the tools to manage that change. So it sounds like quite a wide-ranging project, and indeed it was. But Mella has a very important part to play in that, as the only Northern European example of what's going on.
So you said 2 things there: Northern European and upland.
Yeah.
Before we go any further, why did they choose Mella, do you think? What was it about Mella that made it stand out as a useful site for this kind of project?
The other 4 case study sites, of the other 4 case study sites, 3 were in the Mediterranean. So it's the Baths of Diocletian in Rome, which is an big urban city. There was medieval town on northern Crete at Rhydymno, and then the Greco-Roman city on the west coast of Turkey. And then there was an Atlantic site in Portugal at Troia, which is on a little peninsula about 20-30 kilometres south of Lisbon, open to the Atlantic Sea. So the project was trying to come up with a variety of different landscapes, and it just so happens that the opportunity for Mella to be involved came about in the initial call when the project was being put together. There were about 25 partners across Europe involved in this project, from universities to heritage authorities to trusts and to emergency services. So we had the Italian Fire Brigade involved, for instance. They lead on emergencies in Italy, including the aftermath of climate events and earthquakes, and they lead on heritage damage. So there was a call out for partners. We suggested Mella. We hooked up with 2 other partners in the UK, a data analytics firm based at Manchester University, or spun out from Manchester University, and a consultancy based in London, who'd already done some heritage work with her Horizon 2020. So we put together that as a proposal, and the project lead decided that a Northern European upland site would be a good balance to the Mediterranean Atlantic sites they already had. So you get that spread of different environments. We also had the Austrian weather service, the state weather service, meteorological service, providing the baseline data, the core climate data over the last 50 years. And they were very keen to see a variety of different landscapes. It was one of those fortunate things, as ever with research, you know, it came about almost by chance, but at the time I was specifically looking for a European research project and something around climate change, which was an issue we were starting to see impacting on a number of heritage sites in northwest England through flooding events on rivers, for instance, affecting watermills. So that's how my interest came about, and the opportunity was there, and we were lucky enough to form the consortium.
Okay, so upland site in northern England, what are the sort of issues that it's a multi-period site, isn't it? Mella,
It's
is
multi-period sites. So we've got Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman, and we've got industrial as well.
So what kind of issues have you identified with this multi-period northern English upland site?
There are some specific issues to that upland northern European location. First of all, we're on the west side of the Pennines, so we're exposed to the Atlantic weather systems. So we are exposed to the frequent number of storms coming in from the Atlantic. That's the same as the site at Troia on the west coast of Portugal, but obviously we're in the uplands, whereas Portugal's on the coast. So we're exposed to those violent weather systems. We also, Mella also is on the edge of a large area of upland moorland and peat. So there are specific problems there around the drying out of the peat. And that's important because in the southern Pennines, that peat blankets a lot of prehistoric sites, thousands of prehistoric sites, hunter-gatherer sites, campsites from the early Neolithic and Bronze Age sites as well, which is one of the reasons we were interested in joining the project. So we've got specific issues around changes to vegetation in the upland, and then we've got specific issues about sudden climate events like storms, which can lead to downpours, which lead to erosion, which lead to damage to sites, ultimately undermining sites and washing them away. But there's also another aspect to this, which is that climate change, we know from looking at Shore Cairn in Mella. Shore Cairn is the Bronze Age burial site that is one of the three sites we're looking at in Mella. We know from work there in the 2000s with the Mella Archaeological Trust that there were already vegetation changes up at Shore Cairn since it was first excavated in the 70s and then again in the 2000s. And we wanted to, the Trust wanted to understand that further, and we, because I was based at Salford University at the time, we wanted to understand that more fully as well. And then we have this medieval mill down in the Goyt Valley, which has a complex system of water management features around it. And the Mella Archaeological Trust have been in the process in the last 5 or 6 years of exposing that mill and presenting it to the public as a heritage asset. They wanted to know how vulnerable that was to sudden flooding events and what management systems they might need to cope with that. And also how the exposed brick and stone remains that they'd uncovered with our help at Salford University, how those would fare in changing environment, particularly more extremes of dry and wet periods, which lead to freeze, thaw, and drought conditions, and what management systems they might have to put in place to really repair the mill. So there are a whole host of issues that actually are particularly acute in Northern Europe upland sites, and vegetation change, balance between freeze, fall, action, and those very intense rain episodes. And in the winter, that might be very intense snow episodes as well, are particularly acute in Northern Europe. They're not unique, but you know, in an upland location, and we're talking about sites ranging from 150 metres to over 300 metres above sea level. They have their own particular problems.
Do you pick up on one of the points you made about the peat drying out and being vulnerable to fire? Having a little bit of experience working in those kind of upland environments, they also do reveal a lot of archaeology, don't they, when they do occur?
They're an opportunity for further archaeological research. So in the 3 years we were working actively on the project, so from 2016 to 2019, we had a massive fire event a few kilometres from Shoreken in the summer of 2018, which saw maybe possibly as much as 10 square metres of heather and peat, 10 square kilometres, burnt off north of the site, and also north of Manchester, Saddleworth area, Hollingworth. The subsequent erosion has revealed some new archaeological sites, which the county archaeologist Norman Redhead and myself and the Tameside Archaeology Society have been out to have a look at. That includes previously unrecorded field boundaries, clearance cairns, possible new barrows, Bronze Age barrows, certainly some new campsites, hunter-gatherer sites with flints. And we've been trying to work on the back of that. We've been trying to work with Natural England and the Peak District National Park to get a project up and running to record that archaeology before reinstatement of the peat begins, because there's a plan to reinstate the blanket peat, particularly above Staley Bridge and Hollingworth, by damming gullies and bringing in new plants. But the opportunity is there to actually revolutionise our understanding of that prehistoric landscape, which is very, very poorly recorded. There's plenty of precedents for this. There was a big fire on the moorland at Fylingdales in North Yorkshire about 12 years ago, and that burnt off a lot of vegetation, and in the process revealed dozens and dozens of prehistoric rock art. Sadly, we haven't found any of that up at Staley Bridge at the moment, but I live in hope. And also, we're only at the beginning of the process. So being aware of these environmental threats and having not just a management plan for a site like Mellor, but a wider appreciation of that, of those threats, and the need to get in and record material that is revealed, I think is very, very important. I know that's something that Historic England have been working on for a decade, so we have actually talked to Historic England as well. And in my new role at Ironbridge as Industrial Heritage Support Officer for England, I've just started a conversation with Historic England about looking at and raising the issue of climate change, specifically for industrial sites in England, especially those that are particularly vulnerable on river systems, and also that's water mills and engineering sites. Ironbridge, of course, was flooded in February, March, for instance, of this year, and also other industrial sites like windmills, which can be particularly vulnerable to storms. So these kind of alert management systems that we were experimenting with in Storm, I think have implication across the whole of the heritage sector, and it's about raising awareness of them, but it's also about doing some basic things that actually are not terribly expensive before the event happens. So you can do risk analysis on heritage sites, looking at how vulnerable they are to sudden flooding episodes, to drying episodes, to storms, to erosion. There are actually systems in place now that we've developed in the Storm Project that Historic England have been looking at, and indeed Historic Environment Scotland as well, that allow you to do that on a very straightforward basis, which any owner or trust or charity that owns a heritage site could actually tap into. So it's about spreading that knowledge and getting people to think about risk management before the events happen, and having an incident plan in place, an emergency plan in place, where you can get people out to a site to do emergency repairs if it's been damaged through a storm or through flooding, when it's safe to do so, of course, because people come first. The archaeology quite rightly comes second. But also having longer term management ideas. So for instance, at Mellor, the trust has renovated the Mellor Mill in such a way that there's a guided tour around the site, but also there's an emphasis on making sure that there isn't undue erosion on the site from people walking around. This improved visitor attraction, and also managing the fabric of that site as well. So the Association for Industrial Archaeology was approached in 2015, 2016, just before the project started, to support some renovation work for one of the two big wheel pits there. And that was done with a view to stabilising that wheel pit so that it could be put on public display, but also to make sure that wheel pit had a long-term future as part of that monument, that it was going to be robust enough to cope with changes to the environment over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So there are some very simple management systems that can be done. And then, down the line, there's all sorts of fancy things we could do as well. Putting in weather stations, using particular type of material to stabilise bricks and stone, perhaps reintroducing plants on earthwork sites that can cope with drier conditions or wetter conditions. Some of that is quite technical, but a lot of what I'm talking about is actually straightforward management and planning that any organisation or group who manages a historic site really ought to be considering.
There's a few things there, Mike, that you touched on. One that I thought was interesting was how you can link this to visitor experience. So you can structure the visitor experience to have the minimum impact and therefore maximise any preservation spend and work that you do. So linking those two things together. If anybody's listening to this who does manage an asset, what's the best way of them connecting with your organisation to get the kind of information they need?
The simplest thing would be to get in touch with Bob Humphrey Taylor, who is who's the sort of chair of the Mellor Archaeological Trust. So Bob Humphrey Taylor is chair of Mellor Archaeological Trust. He would be more than happy to talk to other organisations about the Trust's experience in managing these three different sites from the point of view of climate change. Obviously, if people want to email me, that's at Ironbridge. They're more than welcome to do that. The Trust has a website and it has pages on the Storm project, so people can go and browse that and have a look. And on my blog site, I've talked about this on a number of occasions.
So we can put those links on.
Yeah, if you put those links on, you can people can browse at their leisure and have a look at the Storm project. In fact, I'm about to blog again in the light of the incredibly wet February we've had and the incredibly dry May we've had, and some of the damage that's done to industrial sites. in England. But there are two other great resources that I would recommend people to browse at. One, and they are on the websites of Historic Environment Scotland and on the Historic England websites. They both have case studies and policies around climate change. And if individuals want to catch up with a project that's currently going on, there's an Irish-Welsh project going on at the moment looking at the impact of coastal erosion in the Irish Sea, which again is a European funded project. They're about halfway through, and there's a lot of material out there about them going out and recording sites that are eroding around the coast of both Eastern Ireland and around the Welsh coast. So there are some current examples, but there's a lot of free material out there, and there's a lot of guidance on the internet that individuals and organisations can download and have a look at case studies and best practice, and really just talk to the individuals involved. Everybody involved in this subject that I've come across, whether it be in Ireland, Wales, Scotland or England, that they're all very keen to get the message across that there are some straightforward management tools out there. There are some straightforward things you can do to reduce climate change, or the impact of climate change, but also reduce not just the impact of visitors on sites, but also get visitors involved in recording those sites as well. At Mellor, as part of the Storm project, we looked at gathering data from sites using visitors photographing the site and emailing them to the Storm site, so that we could build up a portfolio of images of how the site looks at various times of the year and how it changes. And that's sort of visitor interaction, almost citizen science, I suppose, where you get the public involved in thinking about and recording the condition of the site is one of the ways in which I think social media could really help with the day-to-day recording of these sites and how they change.
Yeah. 2 points. One of them occurred to me when you were speaking, that people studying environmental archaeology, those same skill sets and knowledge, but looking forward, thinking about how climate change in the future is going to affect the assets now. I've never really thought about using that kind of archaeological knowledge in a forward-thinking way.
Absolutely. There's a really good case study by Historic England with the Trenton Peak Archaeological Trust, looking at the Derwent Valley and the impact of past floods on the World Heritage Site there. There's a Derwent Valley World Heritage Site. It's all about the 18th century textile industry. So Derwent Valley in Derbyshire is very, very narrow, runs for about 12, 15 kilometres, but incredibly tight. And you've got 1890 textile sites along there, and there's a history of flooding, to the point where a couple of the mills in the late 18th century were built with flooding in mind. So they had basements down by the river, where they were built by the river Derwent, which could be easily flooded and then unblocked after the floods had gone. But using that historic flood data, Trenton Peak Archaeological Trust were able to come up with a series of hazard maps, which the World Heritage Site in the Derwent Valley and Historic England are using to encourage owners of buildings to take into account these risks for future planning. So that I think is a particularly good case study, well worth having a look at, and there's plenty of free material on the Historic England website there.
Second thing, it relates to a brief conversation we had before we began the interview about our own experience of not spending very much money on petrol recently because of lockdown. But I was also thinking, linking that to what can we do as individuals, and thinking about visitor experience and perhaps digital visits as opposed to actually real visits, driving to a site, going and having a look round and then driving home again. Does that come into the framework that you're looking at, how digital technology can expose assets to the public, but not expose them to the consequences of...
I think it does. And there's a note of caution in my voice, which I'll come back to in a moment. Absolutely it does. And remote means of touring sites and visiting sites are a very good substitute for actually not being on the ground. And one of the things I've seen in lockdown, particularly on social media, are virtual tours of landscapes and sites. Hadrian's Wall. I've seen various medieval castles. There was something on Stonehenge and Avebury. One note of caution is that the way the economics of the heritage world and archaeology world is set up, of course, is that many of these sites, in fact, the vast majority of heritage sites in the UK are privately owned or run by trusts. They rely on visitor income. So the model is there to bring people onto the site. So there is a tension. There's a tension between the need to bring people onto a site and to raise funds from the visitors that is then invested back in the restoration of that site, whether it be a medieval castle, timber frame building or Stonehenge. And then the need to manage the number and volume of people going out to see those sites. In reality, there are only a small number of sites that have a huge volume of visitors, but nevertheless, those can be particular problems, and the problems may simply centre around the amount of parking needed for people to coming in to visit a site. It may not be the volume of people walking on one particular route across a site or through rooms. The National Trust is very well versed in managing the number of people within a property, for instance, so that you reduce the amount of body heat, you reduce the amount of footfall through a particular area so that you're not damaging that structure. But it's managing people coming into the site as well. It's no use going to a site if half the site is covered in a car park, really, is it? That sort of seems to defeat the object. But also we need to experience the past and touching it, smelling it, walking over it is part of the way in which we understand that landscape. As good as social media and virtual reality is, and the internet is, we shouldn't be stopping that experience, but managing the impact, I think, is very important. And that, I think, the experience I've had over the last 4 years is that, human interaction is both good and bad, and you have to recognise that when we observe something, we change it, and that might involve, in archaeology terms, potentially damaging the site or eroding it. So we have to manage that interaction.
Yeah, it fits into larger discussions about infrastructure, doesn't it, and how we get around and who's able to get around and things like that.
It absolutely it does, and I think we need to be more honest about those discussions. Who are we opening up these sites for? Who are we encouraging to come down to those sites? And maybe that model, which is that visitor experience model, maybe that's not the only model we need to think of in terms of financial support for some of these sites. I think that is going to be particularly acute coming out of the present pandemic lockdown, where every single heritage site in the UK has been closed, and the damage to the heritage economy is huge. It's worth 20 odd billion to the UK, the heritage economy, and it's just been closed. And whether people will want to go out in the short term to visit sites. I'm sure they will do if they're outside. Whether they'll want to go inside, that's open to question. But it does rather highlight the fact that we are reliant on a particular type of visitor model, which is basically it's a privatized model where people, in many cases, pay to go into a site. It highlights how vulnerable that is to environmental change, and I suppose the pandemic is an environmental change, isn't it? So we need to sit back and think about that further. As ever, societies prioritise what they prioritise, and where heritage comes in that society is an indication of how much we value the landscape and our own past, I suppose. I would obviously argue that we need to value that hugely, but maybe in other ways, maybe others will not. But for those working in the heritage industry, I think we need to consider how we get people out to sites, how we get them around our sites, and also the social capital that's bound up in those sites, which is a concept that we've been talking about for the last decade, 15 years, but perhaps not necessarily applied so much to heritage and archaeology. It's environmental capital and the value, the notional value to society bound up in the natural world is something that's been talked about by environmentalists for many decades, but heritage and archaeology's only really started talking about the social capital and the wider implication of that really in the last decade, possibly even in the last 5 or 6 years. And maybe this pandemic is a chance for us to have those conversations in more detail.
Yeah, because as someone who's got a vast amount of experience as you have in this area, in this industry, my initial question was about what can we do individually and relate to transport, but if we think about it on a larger, more governmental scale, you're in charge, you've been given the remit to think freely about what could the government do in response to the situation that the pandemic has left us with, to reinvigorate, the heritage, not just the heritage industry, but the actual heritage that we all own, effectively.
That's how long have you got? That's a very tricky question.
Elevator pitch, I think.
I'm going to have a lot of team, I think, before I come up with anything coherent for that. Look, this is about valuing both the current landscape we live in, but also understanding how that landscape evolved. There are some straightforward things that we could do, and I think one of the easiest things to do, for instance, would be promote the reuse of existing structures, rather than the fashion we developed over the last 100 years for demolish everything, build anew. You've got stored carbon in all of the standing structures around us. Now, this is particularly the case for industrial structures and structures of the last 300 or 400 years. But for instance, a very straightforward thing to do would be to remove the VAT on repairs to historic buildings. Which is a campaign that's been going on for the last 30 years, but it's a drag on reusing structures. Whereas new build doesn't have VAT. So there's an immediate bias there. You could level, that would be something very straightforward to do, and actually wouldn't cost a huge amount to the exchequer, but it would promote the reuse of buildings and structures in a way that you see happened really down to the end of the 19th century. It's only really in the 20th century and the arrival of new materials such as concrete and glass and steel that we've been able to think in terms of, well, if you build new houses or or new factories, you demolish everything and build afresh. This is about reusing that landscape in an efficient and environmentally sensitive way. It doesn't stop new build, but it makes us perhaps more aware of that reuse. In terms of deeper, older archaeology, I think we've got to think in terms of managing the more rural landscape in a way that is sensitive, not just to the environment, but to the archaeology as well. And that might mean we have to be careful about how we rewild rivers, for instance. We're talking, there's been a lot of work in the last decade about rewilding rivers in order to reduce river flow, in order to reduce flooding, which with climate change, increased rainfall, and particularly increased rainfall events where you have lots and lots of rain in a short period, is a damn good thing. But there are consequences to that, because the whole of the UK landscape is human made. It's entirely a human product, and particularly with rewilding rivers, we're removing weirs and leats that might go back 1,000 years, if not more. There's an archaeology and heritage impact there. So I think we have to work with the environmental heritage sector in discussing the impact on archaeology and heritage. But I throw those two things out there as things that immediately spring to mind for what they're worth.
Okay. I've not got any more questions, Mike. I don't know if there's I don't know a good way to finish it off nicely, but I don't know if you've got any final comments for anybody that's listening.
The best way to understand a site and a landscape is to go out and look at it, experience it, because it's not just about the visual, it's about what it feels like under your feet. It's about what it looks like. It's about what it smells like as well. And the way to do that is ultimately to get out and look at your site. And you can do that locally. You know, you can go out and have a look at a local site, walk or cycle to your local heritage or archaeology site, and just take some time to walk around that site. And almost certainly, there will be a small heritage archaeology site locally that you've never come across. The county historic environment records are a great way of spotting your local archaeology and heritage sites, and the local list for listed buildings and scheduled ancient monuments, whether you're in Wales or Scotland or England, again, those are accessible online, and you can find something locally. So I go out and have a look locally and explore. Get your 10,000 steps in a day, but also go out and explore on the ground. Feel the past under your feet. That's what.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. It ties together a lot of the things we've talked about: local, physical fitness, and recognising the environment around you as well, not just travelling across the country to these honeypot sites. That's been fantastically interesting for me. I hope so as well for anybody that's listening. What I was going to suggest is, if you could do a blog post with the links in that we've talked about, because initially I was going to attach the links to this, but we have discussed a lot of different websites and resources. Would that be possible?
Yeah, I'm just in the process of, as I said, writing a blog at the moment, just sort of my thoughts on some of the climate events we've had so far this year. I'll put in a pile of links to Historic England, the Storm website, Historic Environment Scotland, CADU, and various other things as well. So
and then I'll link to that blog post. So anybody that's interested in further information can do that.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, Mike. Many thanks.
Thanks, John.